Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Rethinking Porn Addiction, our weekly conversation about pornography. And we're rethinking it, along with the word addiction, also being rethought. If you're new here, I'm Nate. I'm here with Jake and Hans. We are the Average Joes. And down below us, we've got Kristen and Doug, who are our resident therapists. But that's not all they are. They are also friends and colleagues. And Kristen and Jake are married. And so we have a lot of like friendships and family relationships and therapy minds in this space. And our goal is to just have difficult conversations around the subject of pornography. And today's going to be a really interesting one. I have no idea how this is going to go. But if you
and me both, Nate.
If you haven't been around for the last couple of weeks, I recommend going back and listening to the last couple of episodes, because one of the things, and I'm going to have Doug reiterate the point that he made a couple of weeks ago, because I think it was really relevant. But we've been talking about all sorts of things within the context of pornography. But one of the things that we hit on is that calling pornography an addiction is, Doug, what did you say?
It's highly relevant because that's how everybody refers to it, but that doesn't mean it's accurate.
Right. So it's highly relevant. It helps people maybe have a framework or some sort of meaning or a path forward, but medically it is not accurate. And so there's this like juxtaposition of, well, if it's not an addiction, what is it? And that's kind of what we're going to explore today, because there's a lot of people who, and I know I felt this in my life, and I would love to hear Jake and Hans if you felt this, but there's been at some points in my life, there's been this thought of like, can I control this? Like, I don't know if I can stop. Like I don't really agree with what I'm doing, but I keep doing it and I hate myself for it. But so why can't I stop? Like there has to be some other force at work here, which is, I think, one of the reasons that calling it an addiction feels kind of reassuring and good, is that it lends an explanation to the fact that like there's a reason that I can't control the behavior, or there's a reason that I feel out of control. There's a reason that I can't stop doing this. And so that's kind of what I want to explore, that we kind of talked about this week, is if it's not an addiction, what is it? And then what do we do with that information?
One thing I wanted to add, Nate, is you're talking about it. An addiction can also name like this is why I'm drawn to things outside of my values. This is why I'm sexual, like I have a sexual desire towards this or that, because it's an addiction. And if I can quell that. So I just wanted to add that.
Yeah.
Addiction can feel, when we use the word addiction, it can feel as if I'm entering a way of being and behaving that is not me. It's just not me. Mm-hmm. And that can be quite soothing to people who find themselves behaving in a way that is so against basic principle, fundamental values they carry and believe in. It's such a quandary to try to understand ourselves when we behave so abhorrently against our values.
Mm-hmm.
So, Doug, I think I want to hit this your direction, because you seem to be the definer of things in this group. Like you're really good at crystallizing the specific definition, or the thing that we're clarifying, the thing that we're trying to get to here. So
yep.
If addiction isn't the appropriate word to describe a problem of this nature, what is a new word that does accurately describe what people experience? And then can you kind of help point us in the direction of like what the heck we're supposed to do if we don't use an addiction model? Like,
yeah,
I kind of want to volley that to you, and you can guide the conversation however you want from there.
Well, Nate, let's just talk about other language. That's a big topic. That's just a really big topic. Look what we're calling this whole conversation is rethinking the language that literally everybody in the country calls this. That's a big task in itself. I think the thing about what the language I use is called out of control sexual behavior, or when a person feels sexually out of control with their behavior. That's really the alternative language that I'm going to maybe just spend just a second here chatting about. But the reason I use, and Michael Vigorito, the co-author of the book that we wrote about this subject matter, treating out of control sexual behavior, Rethinking Sex Addiction, is a book for professionals, therapists and people who are trying to help men with this issue. We had to come up with a definition other than sex addiction. But the key is, an addiction is like a disease. It's like it's a disorder where out of control sexual behavior is a problem. It's a human behavior problem. So it's like, we don't call an affair a disease, but it's a real problem. I mean, these are real problems that have real injuries and hurt people and all of that. But we don't call an affair a disorder, a disease, something that requires a lifelong of treatment. I just want to use that as a distinction here. That's what out of control sexual behavior is. It's a problem. Lots of people have lots of problems. Well, we don't call every problem something that is a medical diagnosis of a disorder. So that's key here. So what we mean by out of control sexual behavior is when a person's consensual, that's important, consensual sexual urges, thoughts, or behaviors feel out of control to them. That's what out of control sexual behavior is. So first of all, we're only talking about consensual behavior. We're not talking about people who are predatory sex offenders or who, do things against somebody's will. That's out of the question here. We're only dealing with consensual behavior.
And if you want to dive in more into consent, we talked a lot about it in our last conversation.
Yeah, we've talked about it. So I don't, but I think that's really important for people to know. When we're talking about out of control sexual behavior, we're not talking about people involved in violating, criminal acts and doing things not consensual. And there's three aspects that we're talking about. There's sexual urges, there's sexual thoughts, and there's sexual behaviors, or a combination of those, right? These are the things that happen, that people experience, either their urges, which come inside the body, you just kind of feel compelled to do something, your thoughts, all the things that go through your mind that you think about doing, and then your actual behavior. Any or all of those can, to you as a human being, yourself, your own subjective experience, you know what? It feels out of control to me. That's the conversation. Not somebody else has determined your behavior is out of control. But you as a human being have sat there and gone, you know what? I'm not feeling real satisfied with how I'm regulating my behavior. And I think this is a problem for me. So
why
it's
is that
on the person.
Why is it important that you decide and that it's not prescribed or, I don't know, by somebody else?
Well, because most people are much better at changing their behavior when they think it's a problem rather than somebody else does.
Yeah, that's fair.
That tends to be the way people are more successful at changing.
I guess my question is more, I tend to think of things always in the context of a marriage, just because that's where I spend so much of my time.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, like, well, what if my wife thinks that my behavior or my urges or my thoughts are out of control, but I don't?
And there were two words I just want to play with the two of you, because Doug, you said when thoughts, urges, it feels out of control. Mm-hmm. And then Nate brought in, my wife thinks they're out of control. So you may have a partner that's like, oh, it's not a feeling, it's a fact.
This is you
are out of control.
It's an opinion.
Mm-hmm.
It's called an opinion. So somebody might have an opinion that your behavior is out of control. Now, that's an important thing to know. That might actually add significantly to your experience of feeling out of control. But ultimately, the person's got to look at themselves and go, you know what? I'm not happy with this, and I'm not satisfied with how I'm regulating this, and I think I want to address it. But just because somebody has the opinion you're out of control may not be enough for somebody to feel they're out of control.
Okay, I have some more questions that I'm just going to put out here for discussion. What if your employer thinks you're out of control because you are looking at sexual imagery on employer computers, and they've already brought you in to have a discussion to say you can't do it, and you keep doing it? Is that a line? I guess I'm trying to explore, is there a hard and fast line of someone being out of control, or is it
Purely based on a feeling.
Or perception.
Well, perception, right? Because, okay, let's do the workplace thing. Maybe the person's not all that interested in the company policy, and the company can enforce whatever policy they want. Maybe the person's willing to lose their job for that policy. Okay. So that, they may feel out of control because they don't want to lose their job and they can't abide by the company's policy.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's a problem for them then.
Mm-hmm.
And they have income to carry to their family. So that may very much make them feel out of control.
Mm-hmm.
But they have to somehow see that the company's policy makes sense. It's a reasonable policy to enforce. And they like their job and they don't want to lose their job. And so those consequences still have to matter to the person who's engaged in the behavior.
And I love this because in my mind right now, I'm thinking of the negotiation within partnerships and where you might have you may differ in your shared values of, I need you to care about that company policy because you're providing income for our family. And the other one's like, I guess I kind of don't. And I don't like working at my job. And this might be how I'm blowing it up.
Right.
Or you really care. Like, I need you to care about a temple recommend.
Right.
I don't know if I do.
Right.
That's bigger than the problem, Russ. But I guess I'm looking at this is important in the dynamic of a partnership because they may not agree on what matters to them, both that they thought they did.
Boy, and those are painful conversations. Holy cow, those are really, really, as Hans calls them, pain points. There's a pain point.
Yeah. Jake and Hans, what's going through your minds right now?
I'm tempted just to sit here and listen and educate.
I love
educated
listening
for the next hour.
Wait. Okay, what got your interest so far? Because you could have been tuned out like this guy's full of it, and I could care less what you have to say. So what did you hear that makes you want to hear more?
My thoughts, I started self-applying what you were saying and considering my behaviors in the past and my behavior now, and trying to make sense of the idea of I have sexual urges or I have sexual pleasure, and that what came to mind is that's not going to stop. I'm going to continue to have sexual urges and I'm going to continue to enjoy sexual pleasure.
Good for you. That's called sexual health.
Thanks, Doug. I like that idea a lot.
Good. I do too.
And then I was kind of balancing that against what we're talking about of how would I personally redefine or start to define where those boundaries are of how I regulate, you used the word regulate, how I regulate my desire for sexual pleasure and my self-regulation of sexual urges or sexual thought. And I honestly just love hearing what you were saying. I
want to just point out to the audience for a minute, Hans. Look at how quickly you incorporated some words that you heard me say.
Yeah.
I just want to honor that and let you know that is such a common experience I have when I talk with men. They hear these words and boy, they just want to use them. Yeah. They like these words.
I do. I like those. I like it a lot. That's one of the things I've liked and to a very high degree of our conversations is the ability to talk about it with myself, even using different language and vocabulary.
Mm-hmm.
Out of curiosity, Hans, as you heard Doug speaking, was it helpful to have language now name what you have been feeling, but you didn't have the words or maybe a word that fit it as well as like you picked up on the word regulation.
Yeah.
It sounds like that named something for you that you didn't have before. And I don't know if it expands it in your mind or helps you think about it beyond.
Yeah, absolutely. It helps to add context to contextualize maybe a thought that I've had or a feeling that I've had that didn't really have a clean word that went along with it of, okay, I'm going to feel these. And I'm interested to hear, Jake and Nate, what your experiences were in your past, or Chris and Doug also. as I thought about this topic, one of the thoughts that came back to mind is I reached a point in my life that was pretty late in my life where I finally acknowledged something that and accepted something that Doug has said multiple times here. And that is that when I feel sexual pleasure and when I feel sexual urges, that actually means my body is working correctly. Like that's how we've evolved. That's how we're built. And for a long time, because of my religious upbringing, that was in direct conflict with what I heard or learned or picked up were my values. And so the idea of being able to recognize that I am a sexual being or a component of me is sexual in nature, and that I can actually regulate that instead of just having to look at that as something I want to cut out or cut off or get rid of. The idea of regulation, just in these few minutes we've been talking about it, is really empowering for me.
Yeah, I echo that same thing. I mean, I was looking at my notes kind of, and when we stopped, your very beginning, it was kind of this, why can't I stop? And I think for me, that was the position I was in. It was either all or nothing. It was this or that. There was no and, there was no anything else. And so when I go back through my journey, it was, okay, you're engaging in this behavior. How do you stop it? And when you look at that from that perspective, it becomes really, really difficult to do that. And so, and the other thing I think is part of the unhealthy nature of the way my views were formed around it was that there were sort of external based controls. You bring the word control in. I never sat down and thought about what my values were, morals were around this. They were more or less assigned to me. I chose them ultimately to adopt them into my belief system, but they were external. And so the next stage is like, okay, this has been discovered. You've got this, addiction. You have to stop, and that is the path you have to take. And so for me, it was like you would try, you do okay, and then you have a slip or a relapse or whatever the languages you want to call it. And it further compounds this like, oh, I'm an addict because I clearly can't stop. Mm-hmm. When you introduce the concept of regulation into it, I was thinking about when you were talking, both Doug and Hans, of had I gone back, 10, 15 years ago and someone said, you don't have to stop, but can you regulate this? Can you control it? It would have been a completely different mind shift for me that I don't think would have sent me so far down the addiction model, because at the stage I was in, I could go for long periods of time without engaging in the behavior. And so to me, that I can automatically just view that from this lens now, going back and saying, I'm not doing this every day. If I chose to have like a fast from it for a month or whatever, then I could do that. And that clearly to me would say, this is not an addiction. It's something else is going on, and I'm choosing to engage in this because of X, Y, or Z.
Can I give a word for that something else? That's something I like to do in the room every now and then. I hear you talking about having a conflict that you were alone with.
Yeah. 100%. 100%. There's that conflict that isn't being addressed. And honestly, in my position, it wasn't about the conflict. It was just about the behavior. We never even talked about the conflict. We never expressed like, this is this conflict. There were ones that were kind of suggested to me, but it was all, these are sort of determiners in someone who has an addictive personality to sort of further cement me into that mold in that realm.
So rather than it being posed as a conflict that was feeling out of control to you, it was posed as it aligns with what we understand a sexual addiction to be like, and what contributes to it and what causes it. So it was immediately discussed or described in that storyline of an addiction rather than a conflict.
So I had like an abandonment issues like most people have, and it wasn't like, oh, you've got, abandonment issues, let's talk about that and deal with it. It's like, oh, people with abandonment issues are 75% more likely to engage in addictive behavior. And then so it's, and that's where I came from. And it was really, I mean, and I don't know what it's like now, but back when I was kind of going through this initially, it really was, you have to stop. You are an addict. You have to stop. If you can't stop, you are an addict. And it was this sort of self-fulfilling circle of, trying your best effort, doing all these different things, and then failing and feeling worse about yourself and more entrenched in the fact of like, there's nothing I can do about this. I need more help or greater help or more treatment or to spend more money trying to figure, do this, that, or the other.
Jake, I want to stay on that, even though I've talked for a bit now, but what you just said about that cycle you go through of you did it and you have to stop and, oh, I can't stop. I did it again. The idea of regulation for me just kind of introduced the idea of, and this was my personal experience when it came to use of pornography. I would have some kind of sexual urge or desire, or I'd feel aroused, and immediately it would go to, oh, I'm going to use porn again. Like there was for me anyway, I'm curious, Jake and Nate, if you felt it also, or if you recollect, there was very little or no distinction between I'm feeling sexual arousal or sexual urge or sexual thought and following that through with use of pornography. Like I think that cycle for me self-perpetuated itself. And the idea of being able to regulate that now and think about, okay, I have a sexual urge or I'm aroused or something turned me on. And now I have a choice of what I can do with that feeling. Like instead of just being in that immediate repeating behavior of finding the next opportunity to look at porn, now I have the ability to actually think about what I want to do with that and how I want to handle that within my values. So I'm curious if it was for you guys similar or.
I was thinking the same thing, Hans. I was the fact that for let's see, over a decade of my life, the goal and the ideal outcome was just stop.
Yeah.
Stop the behavior. That was the focus of everything. And since we've started having these conversations, the focus has been, let's examine your values. Let's talk about consent, and let's talk about non-exploitation, and let's talk about pleasure, and let's talk about, all of these different things. And now when I'm presented with those same urges that I've felt for, well over almost 2 decades, I can, instead of thinking, don't do it, I can go, what are my values? What are the things that are most important to me? And and what are the ways that I could deal or entertain or cope with these urges or thoughts that are in alignment with the values that I have?
Okay, Nate, sorry, I have to interrupt. I have to add one more word to your list.
Yeah.
See what you think of this word. What can I do to enjoy these urges?
Yeah.
That wasn't on your list, and I felt like, I want to hear enjoyment in there too.
Yeah, and I'm navigating, like it's been really interesting, like to be like a little personal. Like I find that I'm asking for what I want more within my marriage. Like I brought up the topic of sex more with my wife lately than just about any other time in our marriage. And I'm like, hey, I want to explore something. Like, let's carve out some time today to be together. And that's happening more frequently rather than me just like privately in my office trying to like navigate these things alone. I'm starting to have conversations, and the conversations are leading to, I feel like, outcomes that are way more enjoyable. They don't end in like regret and shame and remorse. And on top of that, they bond me and my partner together. There's not shame afterwards. And yeah, it's like, it's really interesting to see how changing the focus from stopping the behavior to examining my values and trying to figure out what do I do with this experience in the context of my values, it feels like it's freed me up.
Well, and it's interesting to hear you all talk, because I hear a shift from being acted upon and that you're really helpless. Like you're being acted upon, you're being tempted, you're being enticed, you're being all these things, and you've just got to stay away or look away or stop, and really shifting into being an actor and engaging in, what does my sexuality look like to me? How do I want to express it? What do I want to feel? How can I enjoy it? And sexuality isn't something that's going to just smother you, but can be an expression of who you are, and getting that into alignment with your values and your relational agreements seems where I'm hearing you guys feel more in control. And well, I would just say that, more in control. And it seems like you have a different relationship with your sexuality, and it moved it from being an enemy of you to something that's a wonderful part of you.
Yeah, it's like we're incorporating our sexuality and instead of trying to turn it off.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Hans, can you say more about that? You went, yeah, right away. What when you hear incorporating versus, what did you say, Nate?
Shutting it off.
Shutting it off. Yeah,
Our sexuality instead of
you just like that. Just made perfect sense to you.
It did, in that, and maybe it's just my own personal awakening or recognition of the fact that I am a part of me is a sexual being. I'm a sexual being by nature, and accepting that and not trying to shut that off. Because for me, a lot of the conflict, and I'm going now to the conflict that I felt when I felt out of control. A lot of the conflict that I personally felt, I think, as I've thought back about this, had to do with the fact that I kept feeling sexual urge or desire. And at that time, that was only related to porn. That's the only context that I really knew how to enjoy that, relieve that, solve that tension. But now I can think, just like Nate said, I don't have to cut that part off. I can't cut that part off. It's not healthy to try and cut my sexual desire off.
We call that no erotic ectomies.
Yeah. Yeah, I can't have an eroticectomy.
Right.
I don't want to. But what Kristen was saying and what Nate said about, now I am moving in and have moved into a space where I can regulate and determine what I want my next behavior to be, or what I want my behavior and enjoyment of that to be. And it's my own responsibility, instead of someone saying you're an addict and as soon as you feel sexual urge, you're going to go masturbate and look at porn. Now I have a lot of power and choice in myself. But it definitely does take redefining that model of addiction to be able to move into a space where we can talk about stuff like that.
So I want to give some language for stuff like that, because you can see how once we move away from an addiction, once we move away from that kind of language, we kind of stumble. It's like, well,
yeah,
what is this? Where are we? What do we call this? And I just encourage people to use the phrase sexual health.
Sexual health.
It's much easier, whatever you said, Hans, and I like kind of just focusing on my sexual health instead.
Yeah. Yeah, I really like that. I will work on adopting that, because I think that's a great descriptor of, I'm working on my sexual health and my sexual being. Mm-hmm. And that's much more empowering than thinking I have to just shut it off and that's the only alternative that's acceptable.
Mm-hmm.
What's that, Nate?
I just saw Kristen have this, and then she kind of pulled back.
Well, I don't want to disrupt the flow, but I love this conversation, and I'm bouncing between so many aspects. Like, I'm genuinely curious if all three of you, the words came up that I wrote down earlier were predetermined versus self-determined. That it seems like a lot of people would like a predetermined outline of what would be considered out of control. And I'm hearing through this conversation that's part of the opportunity in the work, is to start to align of where would I feel out of control? Because we had this, I asked you all, like, when did you know, or when did you feel out of control, or what would your line be? But then I guess I'm just curious, if you have a shared background of values, and I'm hoping this question comes out, I'm still wondering if you all would have different lines of if you had this space to self-determine your sexuality if your lines of out of control would be different within a similar shared value framework of religion?
I think we'd be surprised how similar they are, but I think they would all be different. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Can I give one example of why a person might think their sexual behavior is out of control without having to have a think about it as an addiction?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to take it away from a religious conflict right now. I'm going to put it in another area than a religious conflict, because those are real too. But I just want to offer another one. And that's many, many men feel sexually out of control because they're not keeping the agreements they've made in their relationships.
Mm-hmm.
They have made certain agreements around who they will be, their sexual behavior, their sexual life with a partner, and they are unilaterally changing that agreement without discussing it with their partner, and acting as if they're keeping the agreement.
Yeah.
That is such a common story of why a person feels sexually out of control.
Doug, I really appreciate that. I thought earlier, I didn't mention it, but what you said about taking out of a religious context, I feel like the three of us in this conversation have that religious conflict at some point in our journey from when we were really young until now.
Mm-hmm.
But there is, like you just said, many other out of control conflicts that exist besides just the religious one. And I think that's really helpful to think about it in that way. Religion might be one of the values that you're conflicting with about how do I reconcile sexual pleasure with my values in my religion. But also, like you said, the agreements is another place that's really, really clear where there would be conflict that would arise pretty easily based on my behavior versus what my relational values are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's interesting when I actually go back through my past and think about the times where I felt most out of control. And I look at the behavior independent of the relationships. The behavior itself doesn't feel that out of control. Can I give an example?
I was going to ask, Nate. I was going to say, talk about. I'm curious.
So when I was 21, I was just starting up college. I just got back from serving a religious mission where I'd gone for 2 years and like taught about Jesus to a bunch of people in Santiago, Chile. And I came home on this like religious high. And I was like, I want to go be a camp counselor at like a church summer camp. And so I applied, and it's something that I had done when I was like 14 or 15 years old and really loved. And I thought I could go be a counselor that would just like inspire and uplift and be really fun for all these teenagers. But I had recently also like looked at pornography and then gone and talked to my religious leader about it. So I went and applied for this job. The interview went great. They were like, you're a shoo-in. You're so great. My roommates all went and they interviewed. They all got the job. And then I got a phone call that said, hey, part of the interview process requires us to get like a confirmation from your ecclesiastical leader that like you're good to participate. And he said that you're not taking the sacrament, which is like a religious rite that we do every Sunday at our church, if you guys aren't Mormons. And because you're not doing that, unfortunately, we can't accept your application. And so I had to try and all my buddies became counselors and like, oh man, that sucks. Why didn't you get in? Why didn't you get in? And I'm like, oh. And when in hindsight, I look back on a moment like that and I'm like, I was not glued to a computer screen staring at pornography in a way that I would consider like out of control. Like I was getting my schoolwork done. I was having relationships and being with friends, and I had a social life, and I was not sexually active, and I wasn't out partying, and I didn't have any real outlet for my 21-year-old. Like,
no, you did have a real outlet. It's called masturbation, and it's
right.
common sexual behavior on the planet.
So, but it was not an outlet that was pre-approved. It was not an outlet that was acceptable.
That's better language, right? It wasn't pre-approved. It wasn't acceptable.
Right. So I didn't have an acceptable outlet, and so when I did use that as an outlet, it felt out of control because now I was missing out on opportunities. now I'm not taking the sacrament, and people are seeing that at church, that I'm not like up there doing that. Or now I'm showing up to church late and people are wondering like, man, you sure seem to have to go to the bathroom at the first hour of church a lot. Or like now I'm not, going to be the camp counselor, and like, I feel sick. I feel like, what's wrong with me? I look at the rest of the congregation and my friends, and it's like, why are they all getting to go be camp counselors? And why are they all like, finding and dating girls and getting married? And why are they all comfortable showing up at church and taking the sacrament and passing it? And I'm the one who feels like I'm sitting on the sidelines. And I was sitting on the sidelines because my integrity said, if I'm doing this, I need to talk to my religious advisor about it so I can sort it out, so I can stop. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So I felt like I was having integrity with myself. And I'm sure some of those people who were having the experiences that I wanted were not talking to their religious leader. Whether that's right or wrong, like, that's totally up to them. But I didn't have the means or the language to navigate my own values around this. Mm-hmm. And so it's moments like that throughout my life where I have felt the most out of control, where it's like a choice that I'm making. I couldn't go to both of my brother's weddings, is another example. For religion, for reasons beyond just that, but that was one of the reasons, is because my sexual activity, whatever it was at the time, was not in alignment with the requirements that were in place for me to be able to attend their wedding. It was very like a religious ceremony so it was like a temple wedding. And I couldn't go. So I had to stand outside and wait for my siblings to like get married and then come out with all the friends and family. And I'm standing out there by myself, like, once again, like wondering what's wrong with me that can't be there for that. So I've had multiple, anyway, I feel like I'm just rambling at this point.
That's not rambling. I'm trying to imagine what it's like for people who are listening to this show, hearing your story that takes us to moments of such aloneness and shame and isolation I think you've done a beautiful job of describing what some people would call their sex addiction or porn addiction, or what because
there is that voice that says, if you don't want to miss out on the wedding, or if you want to get the job, or if you want to take the sacrament, or if you want to go to the temple, or if you want to, fill in the blank, baptize your kid or whatever, why can't you just stop? And that's why I think in large part the goal is that I just want to stop.
And I think that's where I empathize as you were telling that story. And I echo, that was not rambly. I think you named a lot of feelings and experiences that people have, of another feeling of out of control, of I have these sexual urges and there's no acceptable outlet. And I feel out of control of, I don't know what to do. And can someone help me navigate this part of my life that I could really use some support and meaningful discussion and guidance and maybe some validation of, like what Doug said. Doug chimed in right there to be like, oh, Nate, masturbation is the most normal behavior. But you quickly were able to say, not an acceptable option.
Right. That's the key. What do we do with sexual behavior that is so unacceptable and is responded to in the way you described? Powerful relationships in your life, and the power they have to respond in very public and dramatic fashion.
Yeah.
What do we do when we have a conflict with our sexual life, not an out of control behavior?
But I do think you are in systems where you are the problem. The system works. The prescription works. You're out of control. And these consequences are unfortunately a byproduct of you. And I say that because I think that's the message a lot of people get.
Yes. Will you say more about that?
Well, I think it can be really easy you have this whole system. We could look at a family system. We can look at a particular culture. We could look at a particular religion. And if it's a predetermined set of sexual values or morals, we already know this works. If you live this way, then you will be happy, healthy. You'll be able to participate. So then by default, you lose on all fronts. Like if you just stepped up, which this is a doable standard, this is a livable standard. Look, thousands of people are doing it. And you're not. You're the only one outside of the temple. You're the only one that's not going to be the camp counselor. You're broken. That's powerful to feed that you are in fact. And then that feedback keeps coming of, yep, see, I'm out of control. Here I am again. I keep having these experiences. And if I could just stop, then my life would be better. But this is the problem. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah.
I want to do a point of language for our group because 2 people have said it so far. Does that make sense? I think what people are asking is, have I been clear?
Have I been clear?
Yeah.
And boy, the 2 of you have been so clear. So I just want to honor that. You've been very clear. What you're saying, the stories, what you're saying, we may think aren't very sensical, from one vantage point. But that's not what I think I really want you just acknowledge you both for being so clear in what you said. That's really what's so important here.
And I will just own a name since some people are listening and some people are watching. I think your story, Nate, and I think I feel it. I feel it burn in my chest because that's the reality so many people live with.
Yeah.
Is that if you could just get it together, the system is flawless. And I think where my tears come from is little you, is little Jake, is little Hans trying to make sense of the world around them, trying to figure it out and having these very public moments that are very real. Just the excitement of being a camp counselor and being like, sorry, that's real. And so I think that my whole chest is just radiating with the deep empathy I have for people trying to navigate this felt emotion.
And I want to stack on top of that where my heart hurts now is I know there are a lot of people watching who feel like their marriage and their children and their families are on the line, where they've been through the little Nate, little Jake, little Hans situation where it's like, missing out on being a camp counselor is one thing. Going through a divorce and losing your children and a relationship with your wife, that's a different league.
Yep.
And that's the reality that some people are facing right now.
I'm glad you named that because I think that's where my heart also aches. Yeah. One of the things you hold as a therapist are just so many stories and lives, and you hold it. And in this environment where I'm not all your therapist, we're friends and colleagues, and the consequences can be exponential where people do lose relationships with their children. They do lose everything.
Kicked out of their family, kicked out of their church, ostracized by their community, seen as a pariah. There's a lot that comes along with not being able to do what is expected of you.
I want to add an in-between point in your story that I'd be interested in the others, Jake and Hans, responding to as well. In the story is a period of time where you've each alluded to, had there been a place to go have a conversation, to talk, to not be reacted to, but to help me deliberate and think about this conflict without having to deal with a reaction or a punitive public scorn, if there was just a way to have a conversation. And this is the price I see men paying in the 20-some years I worked with men in groups. They had to pay the prices you've described, and Kristen, that you've described around marriages and relationships or whatever, jobs. They've had to pay those prices before they had access to a conversation with me or with other people, where these conversations we're having in this room could actually happen. So the sequence is what breaks my heart.
Yeah.
The price men have to pay in our culture to just have these conversations is so great. It just aches me in a way that is profound. And I hear it in your stories today.
it's another reason why I think the 12-step program is so popular, is that you go to group meetings and you sit in a group and you share your story. And I don't know, other than talking to a therapist, I don't really know of another forum where men can get together, maybe a men's group or something like that. But there are very few forums where men can get together and talk in a judgment-free zone about what they're dealing with and get real support, and not just the support of, do you need an accountability buddy to help you stop?
Yeah.
I don't know where do you find that?
Well, some people are sitting here listening to this conversation for that very reason.
Yeah.
The reason we decided to do this show is you all imagined those men out there and didn't want them to be alone like the three of you felt. That's what I remember our conversation being about.
So we have 15 minutes left. We get a lot of requests from listeners to talk about a little bit about the other side of the equation. And once again, I feel like we focused a lot on our experience, Jake, Hans, and Nate, as the husbands, or as the people who are consuming or looking at sexual imagery. And I would love, in the context of this conversation, to maybe speak a little bit to the partners who may not be participating in this and who may be looking at their partner in disgust or disapproval or fear, not able to understand why they can't stop, and not able to understand, why they look at sexual imagery in the first place. How do we navigate that conversation? Or
can I just pose your question a little differently? Rather than don't understand, let's see if we can have this conversation from the perspective of their conflict as well.
Right.
These are people with conflicts.
And so Carmen just mentioned, don't leave women out of this. They struggle too. And this is not just a men's problem.
Right.
And I do want to speak to that so often right now. And I think, and Doug, please chime in on this, but there's very little research or support or anything for women that are struggling with feeling out of control with their sexual behavior, which can add another layer of brokenness of oh, maybe it's just me because I'm not seeing this anywhere.
Yeah.
And so yes, there are plenty of women, and women have had very few venues to talk about their sexuality either. And to Doug's point, the price for admission for a lot of women is assault or abuse or sexual harm in some fashion that then allows them to start exploring boundaries and consent and their sexual rights and pleasure. And what do I want? I know what I don't want, but that's all.
And violent behavior in response to women not keeping their sexual agreements is a more acceptable response, unfortunately, in our culture than it is violence directed at men who don't keep their sexual agreements in relationships.
Yeah.
So it's a terribly sad generalization, but unfortunately, it might be the avenue some women get help is because they've been the object of violence as a consequence for their not keeping their sexual agreements.
Yep.
So if we were to flip this script and just, I don't even know where to start, because I hesitate to even bring it up because I don't want to speak for a group of people that I am not a part of. Does that make sense?
You're very clear. Yep, you're
very clear.
And so I'd like to speak to that group, or maybe speak to I don't know. I just want to have a conversation about that.
Nate, I mean, we're navigating this live without script. I like the idea. I don't know if it's possible of bringing in my partner. Jake's partner's in the room. I don't know if your partner's open to that, but having them talk would be, and in this conversation, I think would be really incredible. And for some of our listeners could be an amazing way for them to experience that.
Like right now?
I would. No. We really like agreements as part of how we function together. Right. So we'd have to have an agreement first before we do action. Okay. This is not unilateral decision making.
But Nate, I think I mean, this isn't exactly the route where you were going, but I had something that I wanted to express that I felt in my heart, in my chest, as you started to talk about partners and thinking back about what Doug and Kristen said about just starting a conversation. I think back to the conflicts that I had around sex earlier in my life. And the idea of having any kind of conversation was terrifying. Like I cannot think of a single person in my younger life where I would have comfortably gone to them and said, hey, can we talk about sex? Like that just did not exist. And I don't know if that's only because of my religious upbringing and the culture that I was raised in, or if that is common across our American or international culture. Yeah.
I don't want to disrupt you, Hans.
Where I was going with that is when I'm thinking back to how things could have played out differently. Like I remember having some very real conversations with my mom when I was younger and using porn in their home. And that was a very real conflict for me. And if I somehow, or she somehow, or the two of us somehow together could have had conversations that maybe were proactive and progressive, as opposed to just defined by the values that were part of that conversation, I think that could have been incredibly powerful and life-changing for me. And I think about the people that are listening and how we can offer them help. And I don't want it to be as simple as saying, if you can, find places that have opportunity for conversation. But I do think, for me, that's really where it could have started. And that's how I could have changed my journey. And I love the idea of having that other half in the room, whatever the other half of that agreement or conflict is. If that happens on our show, fantastic. If not, I would love to just explore that idea of how do we potentially even start those conversations, or how do we look for those people with whom we can have that conversation besides having to go through the high price of admission that Chris and Doug have talked about.
Mm-hmm.
I think about, you bring up the religious conflict, but developmentally, if we are sexual beings, we are developing as sexual beings. And if you're getting mirrored back the words. So if you don't have sexual words in your home, like anatomy, and when you ask a question, if it's not mirrored back of like, oh, great question, and engaged in, somewhere it starts to drop off. And I kind of think of these conversations as, I like to believe, and I'm curious for you all, if you feel like you've grown in your ability to have these conversations, to regulate your emotion within these conversations so you can actually have them, that's been a skill that's been developed over time.
Yeah.
To do that later on. So I'm not sure if it's only the religious piece, but also a lack of skill development around sexual health conversations, language, knowing that you can ask questions, that you can explore, and that it's okay and safe.
And normal. So
Totally normal.
This is one of the things that I remember talking to you about, Kristen, when we did our series of interviews together for my show. Is one of the things you said is, as a sex therapist, what most people come to my office wondering is, am I normal?
Mm-hmm.
And this might be a good way to segue into an audience question that we just got.
Mm.
Somebody said, how do we know what a normal sexual urge is and what are porn baggage induced urges? How do we know who we are sexually after all of the shame, the fear, the despair that came from struggling with porn for so many years? I can relate to that. Like, you feel like you get distorted in a lot of ways when you're in values conflict for so long.
Can you put the question back up and just leave it there for a minute?
Yeah,
because
of course.
When somebody asks something so well asked, I think let's let their words live for a minute, because these are really important questions. Notice how the sexual urges only have one of two options. They're either normal or they're contaminated. That's it. neither of normal or contaminated is a way to understand who we are erotically. Because who we are erotically does not stand up to some normal standard. Who we are erotically is actually very personal, very idiosyncratic, meaning, what one little scene in a sex scene for Jake might be the most erotic thing he could look at, and Hans looks at it and can't wait to get away from it because he's looking for something else. These are very idiosyncratic moments, and they're personal and they're individual. And so the sexual imagery is a window into the world of the erotic. And what often people are disturbed by is who we are erotically doesn't stand up well to social customs and to, polite conversation, or, what's a good guy? It does not meet up to those standards. And so this binary question is really the problem. If we're going to really understand who we are sexually and our sexual urges, we can't stay in the world of either or, right or wrong, good or bad, normal, abnormal. If that's where the conversation goes, we're not going to learn very much about ourselves at all.
I just had this conversation, sorry, Jake, of when we move, just to help this listener, when we move out or right or wrong, we can move, is this an extension of my values? Like, where does this land? You can be really curious.
And how do we know who we are sexually after the shame, fear? I love that question.
Yep.
Because that's really the arc of the whole task ahead in a to know about what our sexual health is we first have to kind of be aware of what we've decided we're ashamed of, what we're afraid of, what we feel despair about doing. We have to kind of figure out what all those things are. And then we have to follow the pleasure. That's how we figure out who we are. And so that's not in that sentence. And so anytime somebody's trying to figure out who they are sexually, the first thing I look for in that sentence is, where's the pleasure? Where's the pleasure? Where's the pleasure? Because it's the pleasure that tells us who we are. Now, the pleasure could also be disappointing because we don't want to be who we are. Who pleasure tells us we are. Just because it's pleasurable doesn't mean we're happy with it. But it does give us pleasure.
Jake, say what you're going to say. I really want to hear.
Well, I was thinking about the dangers of this sort of binary conversations that we have, and going back to your other comment when you said you thought about having these conversations, and you used the word terrifying, which is a very strong word, but it's also a word that sort of resonated with me in my experience. And I think I look back at the fear of consequence, and it was terrifying because I was trying to approach the conversation with a set result in mind, or at least some variation therein. And I think that's one of the biggest steps for me along the way, was to sort of try to shift from that binary thinking of, okay, I want to have this conversation, I want this to be the end result, to I want to explore in this conversation with my partner and see what becomes. And it goes back to kind of our first or second episode of, it's at some point you have to ask yourself, like, do you really want to be known, and do you really want to know your partner? And if that answer is a sincere yes, then that's going to go a long way to taking the terror out of the conversation and leaving room for open dialogue. And where that goes, it's the same as this question of, it's going to be individual. It's going to be a process, and it's going to be a journey, and there could be some anxiety around the anticipation of it, but there shouldn't hopefully be fear or terror, because hopefully you're having these conversations with someone who you love and trust.
Yeah, Doug, I feel bad. I was so anxious to hear what Jake said. I didn't really respond to what you said. Also, what the two of you, I think, just for me illustrated is the idea that to answer this question, and if I were to try to personally answer this user's question, I think I would end up going somewhere towards the answer is try to start to explore that, to use the ideas of sexual health in exploring what are my values, what are my urges, what's my pleasure. And that is a really complex answer. That's not something that I can say, or that any of us could say yes or no, that's normal or abnormal.
Mm-hmm.
The answer for me really is becoming, let's figure out what sexual health means for me and my partner and me and my kids and me and all of those relations around me. And I love it. I feel it in my heart. I don't have words really to express how I think powerful that is to change from right or wrong, black and white, into let's explore some sexual health together.
I love it when you summarize our episodes. This should just be the weekly thing.
And I want to say, Jake, I love how well you listen to us, take notes, and then bring such thoughtful observations. I look forward to what you say after I see you writing down. It's like, what's he gonna say? So thank you for that.
Well, we're at our hour. Thanks for another adventurous conversation full of unexpected twists and turns. And thank you to our audience for participating. There were some fantastic comments today, and some that we didn't get to that I'm reading that were just really wonderful. And we really appreciate you guys tuning in and sharing this with the people who need it. For those of you who might be joining the first time and want to know where to get more of these conversations, just go to rethinkingpornaddiction.com. And we'll be back again next Monday with another conversation. And you guys, thank you. Today was lovely. I love you all.
Thank you all.